They say the harbor water, in February, holds you gently before it pulls you under. They're lying. It bites into your skin like 1,000 blades of ice, crushes your chest, and steals the breath right out of you in a single heartbeat. Marlo Brennan knows this, because she threw herself into it at 3 a.m. on a bone-cold Boston night. Mara's 28, a soft, full-figured woman with messy auburn hair and a round face dusted with freckles, a night shift baker whose hands are calloused from dough and oven fire. She's used to being invisible. People look right past girls like her without a second glance. But that night, dragging herself home along the seaport with a few crumpled bills in her pocket and old debts haunting her mind, Mara heard a sound that wasn't a scream, but the heavy, wrong splash of water breaking apart. A young woman had been standing too close to the slick, icy edge, and then in one fragile moment of crisis, one careless step, she vanished beneath the black surface. Mara didn't stop to think. If she had, she'd have remembered she wasn't a strong swimmer, that she had no health insurance, that the water could take them both. But something in her, something that had once watched a person she loved slip away without being able to save them, refused to let it happen again. She kicked off her shoes and dove. She had no idea that the woman she was pulling from that freezing water was Soraya Voss, the younger sister of Cain Voss, the coldest and most powerful man in New England, a crime boss who could silence an entire city with a single phone call. She didn't know that pulling that woman up meant dragging herself into a world of secrets guarded by guns, of mansions cold as ice, and of a man whose hands were always cold because he'd forgotten warmth a long time ago. Mara saved a life that night, but she was about to discover that sometimes saving a stranger is the exact moment your whole life begins to change in ways you never saw coming. If you love stories about quiet courage and hearts that seemed frozen for good, hit that like button to support the channel. Don't forget to share this video with someone who needs reminding that they're not invisible. And subscribe with the notification bell on, so you never miss what happens next in this story. Mara woke in a pale white light and the steady beeping of a heart monitor, the first warmth she felt after many hours coming from the thick heated blanket, pulled all the way up to her chin, though her whole body still shuddered in waves as if the cold of the harbor had frozen itself into her very marrow. A middle-aged nurse with a kind face leaned over the bed, her voice gentle but touched with an amazement she could not quite hide, telling her she was lucky to be alive, that she had been found unconscious on the seaport pier, soaked through and freezing, her body temperature having dropped to a dangerous level. Mara tried to push herself up, her throat burning raw as if she had swallowed broken glass, and the first question that burst from her was not about herself but about the girl she had pulled up from the black water. Where was she? Was she all right? Had she been saved? The nurse paused, confusion flickering across her eyes, then answered softly that Mara had been brought into the hospital alone, that there had been no one else, that the emergency record from that night listed only her name, with no young female patient admitted from the harbor area. Mara felt her chest tighten. She shook her head hard, insisting that she had given a girl mouth to mouth, that she had felt a faint breath return beneath her hands, that she had heard the girl whisper something before slipping away again, that she could not have imagined a living person of flesh and bone like that. The nurse only patted the back of her hand with pity and said that brutal cold sometimes caused the human mind to build images that were not real, that she should rest, and then she quietly left, leaving Mara alone with confusion rising inside her like the tide. She looked down at her hands, at her scraped red palms, at the fingertips still wrinkled from having been in water too long, and she knew very clearly that she had not imagined anything. She still remembered the weight of the girl's body in her arms, still remembered the sharp, fishy smell of harbor water mixed with the scent of expensive soaked fabric. When she was discharged the next morning, something stunned Mara even more than the hospital's denial. When she shakily asked the cashier about the hospital bill she knew she could never afford, the employee looked up at her with polite surprise and said that the entire cost had been paid in full, in cash, by someone who had left no name. Mara stood rooted in the middle of the hospital lobby, scattered pieces turning wildly in her mind, a girl who had vanished without a trace, a record wiped clean as if it had never existed, and some invisible hand that had quietly lifted from her shoulders a debt that could have crushed a whole year of her baker's wages. She put on her night shift coat, which had been dry cleaned and folded neatly on a chair. And when she slipped her hand into the pocket to search for her apartment key, her fingers touched something cold, hard, and heavy. Something that did not belong to her. She pulled it out, and her breath seemed to stop. It was a silver pocket watch, old-fashioned, its surface dulled by time but still carrying the refinement of something valuable. And on the lid was a single letter V engraved in a sharp, elegant line, curling like a proud signature. Mara remembered the moment in the water, when the girl had clung to her arm with desperate strength in her panic, her fingers reaching for anything that might still hold her to life. And surely in that chaos, this object had fallen into Mara's coat pocket without anyone noticing. She turned the watch over. There was no inscription, no message, only that silent letter V, but it was living proof that the girl had been real, that last night had not been the hallucination of a mind frozen by cold. Someone wanted the world to believe nothing had happened on that pier that night. Someone was powerful enough to erase a person from every record, and that same someone, for some reason, had chosen to repay her in silence instead of letting her sink beneath their secret. When Mara stepped out through the hospital doors into the skin-cutting cold of a Boston morning, she felt with absolute clarity that a gaze had settled on the back of her neck, an unpleasant prickling sensation that made her turn around. Across the street, a sleek black car with dark windows sat motionless along the curb, its engine still running softly, releasing a thin white mist that dissolved into the cold air. And though she could not see anyone inside, Mara knew for certain that someone was watching her from behind that glass. She tightened her grip around the silver watch until the metal edge pressed into her skin, pulled her collar higher, and hurried toward the subway station, her heart pounding not simply from fear, but from a chilling certainty that her invisible, quiet life had just been noticed by some force, and that it would never be as peaceful as before. 3 days after that fateful night, Mara returned to the familiar rhythm of Hartley's bakery in Dorchester, where she had stood beside the oven for 6 long years, her hands kneading dough in the heat and the fragrant rise of yeast, trying to lock the silver watch and all the unanswered questions away in some sealed corner of her mind. She had kept it hidden deep inside the pocket of her winter coat, telling herself that perhaps it was best to forget, to let everything pass like a winter nightmare. But the feeling of being watched would not release her. It followed her on the way home, lingered outside her apartment hallway, and hovered inside her broken sleep. That morning, while Mara was arranging freshly baked loaves on the glass shelf, the little bell above the bakery door suddenly rang, and at once she felt a change in the air, as if the temperature in the room had just dropped by several degrees. 2 men walked in, and they looked so out of place that every pair of eyes in the shop seemed to freeze, because this was a place of worn coats, work boots, and faces tired from making ends meet, while these 2 wore perfectly tailored black suits, so expensive that one of them probably cost more than a month of her apartment rent. They did not look at the pastry case. They did not ask the price of a single loaf. They only looked straight at Mara, with a calmness that chilled the back of her neck. The man in front, tall, with close-cropped hair touched with silver, and eyes flat with no expression at all, came to the counter and called her by her full name, Marlowe Brennan, in a low, polite voice that was still cold as cooled steel. Mara clenched the hand towel in her palm, trying to keep her voice from shaking as she asked who they were and what they wanted, and the man only dipped his head slightly and answered that their employer wanted to see her, and that it was not an invitation she could refuse. She stepped back half a pace, her back touching the bread rack behind her, stammering that she was in the middle of her shift, that she did not know anyone, like the person they were describing. But the man said calmly that their employer knew very well who she was, knew about the night she had plunged into the freezing water at the seaport pier, knew about what she had pulled from the black water. Those words made the blood in Mara's body seem to turn to ice, because she understood at once that the person behind those dark figures was the one who had erased every trace of the girl, the one who had quietly paid the enormous hospital bill, and now they had found her at her workplace, which meant they had known about her for a long time, had been watching her silently through the past several days. The bakery owner, a heavy-set man who was always slick with sweat, poked his head out through the kitchen window, and the moment he saw the 2 black suits and those stern faces, he quickly withdrew inside, leaving Mara to face them alone, And in that moment she felt her familiar world shrink around her, fragile and powerless. She whispered that she did not want any trouble, that she was only an ordinary baker. And the man answered with a sentence that left her no way out, saying that if she agreed to go with them now, everything would be simple, that their employer only wanted to speak with her and express gratitude, and had no intention of hurting her. Mara glanced through the bakery's grease-streaked window, and outside, a sleek black car just like the one she had seen parked in front of the hospital was waiting along the curb, its engine running smoothly as it breathed white smoke into the freezing morning. One part of her screamed at her to run, to shout, to call the police, but another, clearer part of her mind reminded her that if these people had truly wanted to hurt her, they had had plenty of chances over the past few days. While she had walked home alone late at night, they would not have needed to come in broad daylight, openly and politely like this. They wanted something else, and that something was tied to the girl she had saved, to the letter V on the silver watch lying heavy in her coat pocket. Mara drew in a deep breath, taking in the familiar smell of flour and caramelized sugar one last time, as if trying to hold on to the little piece she still had left. Then she untied the flour-speckled apron, hung it on the hook behind the counter, and said in a voice she forced to sound firm that she needed to get her coat. The silver-haired man gave a slight nod and stepped back to make way for her, with a cold courtesy more frightening than roughness. And when Mara walked out through the door of the bakery, she knew so well and sat down on the soft leather seat inside the luxurious car, filled with comfortable warmth. She knew she had just crossed an invisible line, leaving behind her small and resigned life to enter a world she had never dared imagine. A world where secrets were guarded by power, and where her kindness that night was about to pull after it consequences she could not possibly foresee. The car drove for nearly 1 hour, leaving the cramped streets of Dorchester behind, and moving toward the quiet stretches of Brookline, where mansions hid behind towering iron fences. And when the heavy gate opened for the car to glide onto the long gravel drive, Mara felt as if she were entering a world carved from stone and ice. The mansion appeared before her, massive and cold, its gray stone walls rising beneath the gloomy winter sky, beautiful in a severe way, and without the slightest warmth of life. The silver-haired man led her through a vast hall paved with gleaming marble, the sound of her shoes echoing strangely in the immense silence, then stopped before a dark wooden door, opened it, and stepped back, leaving her to enter alone. Inside was a large study with bookcases rising high along the walls, a stone fireplace crackling in one corner, and standing with his back to her by the window was a tall man with broad shoulders stretched beneath a white shirt. He did not turn around at once, only spoke in a low voice that carried through the room, telling her to sit down, and Mara, though her heart was pounding, remained where she was and answered that she would rather stand. The man turned, and her breath caught slightly, because he had a coldness about him that almost hurt to look at. Short platinum hair, a sharp-edged face shadowed with rough stubble, and steel-gray eyes that looked both exhausted and lit from within by a restrained anger. This was Cain Voss. The man all of Boston knew by name but few dared mention, the boss behind the harbors, and the unnamed flows of money across New England. He looked her over from head to toe with cold scrutiny, then remarked that she was younger than he had expected, and poorer than he had expected, and Mara, fear suddenly giving way to a flare of wounded pride, answered that she earned her living with her own honest hands, unlike some people. The corner of Cain's mouth twitched, not quite a smile. He stepped closer and placed a security camera photograph on the wooden desk, blurry but clear enough for Mara to recognize herself, plunging into the black water at the harbor that night. He said his security team had watched the footage countless times, that his sister, Soraya, had gone to the harbor alone during a night of crisis, had stood too close to the slick icy edge and slipped into the water, and that without Mara, the girl would no longer be alive. His voice caught for the briefest moment before the cold mask returned, and he went on to say that since that night, Soraya had barely spoken, barely responded to anyone, not to doctors, not to servants, not even to him. His sister had folded herself into silence like a closed door. But there was one thing she repeated during her rare moments of awareness. The woman at the harbor, the woman who had pulled her from the water. Mara felt her heart sink, and she softly asked how the girl was now. For the first time, Cain's steel gaze softened slightly, and he answered that Soraya was alive, that her body was recovering, but her mind was still lost in some place he could not reach, no matter how much power or money he had. With a bitterness rare enough to be startling, he admitted that he could buy this entire city, but could not buy a single word from his own sister, and that helplessness showed plainly on the face of a man who seemed as if nothing could ever shake him. Mara, though still wary, felt something inside her soften before the rawness of his pain, and suddenly she remembered the watch. After a moment of hesitation, she said she had something that belonged to his sister, that in her panic beneath the water, the girl had clung to her and left something behind. When she pulled the silver pocket watch from her coat pocket and placed it on the desk, showing him the letter V engraved on its lid, Kane's expression changed completely. His eyes narrowed, then opened with a shock and emotion he could not hide in time, and he said quietly that it was an heirloom of the Voss family, his father's watch, the thing Soraya always carried with her like a protective charm and never let out of her hand. In that moment, every doubt in him seemed to dissolve, because no fraud could have known about that watch, no one except the person who had truly touched his sister's hand beneath the freezing water that night. Kane looked at Mara in an entirely different way, no longer with cold suspicion, but with something close to reluctant acknowledgement, and he said slowly that perhaps fate had brought her here for a reason, that he had something to discuss with her, something that could change her entire life. Kane walked toward the large wooden desk and picked up a thin folder. He placed it in front of Mara and said he needed someone Soraya trusted, someone who could stay beside her, speak with her, and pull her back from the dark place where her mind had wandered. Mara looked at him with suspicion and answered that she was only a baker, not a psychologist, not a nurse, that she knew nothing about caring for someone as deeply wounded as his sister. Kane shook his head. He said that was exactly what made her different, that he had hired the best specialists, the most expensive doctors, and all of them had failed. Soraya had closed herself off to them the way she had closed herself off to the whole world. But she kept mentioning Mara, the woman at the harbor, the woman who had risked her own life to save a stranger. He said slowly that in his sister's eyes, Mara was not someone being paid to care for her. She was the person who had chosen to jump into the freezing water when everyone else would surely have turned away. And that honesty was what Soraya was starving for, the one thing money could never buy. Mara was silent, feeling the weight in his words, and she understood something that made her heart both lighten and ache, that she mattered to this man not because she was a danger that needed to be silenced, but because she was the only bridge to his sister's frozen soul. He needed her alive and close, not gone. Kane opened the folder, revealing a contract, then pointed to the number written at the bottom of the page, a salary of $8,000 a month, along with a room in the mansion and full health insurance. Mara stared at that number and felt as if the ground beneath her had shifted, because it was money she had never dared dream of, old debt wiped clean, a warm roof over her head, the insurance card she had once desperately needed in the darkest days of her life. The days when she had watched someone she loved slip away, simply because she had not had enough money to save them. That memory twisted through her heart like a knife, and perhaps it, more than the number on the paper, was what made it impossible for her to turn away, because she knew too well the helplessness of watching a life slide out of reach, and she did not want to let Soraya fall into that abyss if there was any chance she could reach out her hand. But Mara was not the kind of person who surrendered easily. She lifted her head, looked straight into Kane's steel-gray eyes, and said she had conditions of her own. Kane raised an eyebrow, his voice touched with cold mockery, as he replied that she was not in a position to bargain. But Mara did not waver. She said that if he truly wanted his sister to recover, then he had to listen to her. She demanded that Soraya's room not be locked from the outside, because a wounded person could not heal in a place that felt like a prison, and that no cameras be installed in the girl's private space, because privacy and trust were the things Soraya needed to be given back, not taken from her again. Kane's eyes darkened. He said those security measures existed to protect his sister, but Mara answered that those walls and those lenses were perhaps part of what had pushed Soraya to the edge, that a person watched with every breath would only feel more suffocated and alone, and that he could not imprison a soul and then expect it to become free again. The words seemed to touch some hidden place inside Kane. He looked at her in silence for a long time, the fire in the hearth throwing wavering shadows across his stern face. And Mara had the feeling that he was weighing not only her conditions, but something much larger about the way he had loved and protected his sister all these years. She added her final condition, that she needed to be free to leave the mansion on weekends, because she was still a person with a life of her own, not an object bought and stored inside a glass case. A long silence stretched between them, then Kane gave a single slight nod. He said he agreed to all of it, and in that low voice Mara heard a rare concession from a man far more used to giving orders than listening. He pushed the pen toward her, and when Mara took it and signed her name on the contract, she felt as if she were signing herself onto a road with no return, stepping fully into a strange and dangerous world. Yet at the same time, somewhere inside her, there was a faint glow of something she had lost long ago, the feeling that her existence mattered to someone, that her hands, calloused from bread dough, might this time be able to save something precious. Kane watched her finish signing, then said quietly that he would take her to meet Soraya, and when he turned to lead the way, Mara tightened her grip around the contract, drew in a deep breath, and followed him deeper into the cold castle, where a young woman was waiting for someone to pull her back toward the light. Kane led Mara through long, seemingly endless corridors paved with marble, the light from crystal chandeliers falling coldly over them, until they stopped before a wooden door at the end of the second-floor hallway, and he said quietly that this was Soraya's room, that he would wait outside, because his presence only seemed to make her close herself off even more. Mara gently pushed the door and stepped into a large room decorated with the most expensive things. A great bed covered in silk blankets, paintings on the walls, an easel standing motionless in the corner. But all that luxury only made the emptiness everywhere feel sharper, as if this were not a room meant for living, but a beautiful golden cage holding a fading soul. Beside the large window overlooking the snow-covered garden, a young woman sat curled in an armchair, her legs drawn close to her chest, her eyes fixed on the space outside without truly seeing anything. Soraya was only 19 years old, yet she looked as though she had carried the weight of an entire lifetime on her shoulders, her face pale and thin, her eyes darkened by sleepless nights, her long hair falling loose to cover half her face like a curtain she had drawn to separate herself from the world. Mara did not hurry closer. She had learned that from the hard years of her own life, that a wounded person did not need someone to rush in and break down the walls they had built. They only needed to know that someone was willing to sit outside those walls, without judgment, without pressure. She quietly pulled a small chair nearer but still kept enough distance, then sat down and simply said her name was Mara, that she had not come here to force Soraya to talk or do anything at all. She only wanted to sit there for a little while. Soraya did not turn her head. She did not answer, but Mara noticed the girl's thin shoulders tighten slightly, and then loosen again, a small sign that she had heard and was weighing the presence of this stranger. The silence stretched between them, but it was not the suffocating silence Mara had felt throughout the mansion. It was a gentler quiet, like the stillness between two people looking out at falling snow. Mara did not try to fill it with hollow comfort. She simply sat there, letting Soraya slowly grow used to the calm warmth of a person who carried no expectations. After a long while, Mara softly said that it was very cold outside, so cold she could still remember the chill sinking all the way into her bones that night, and when she mentioned the night at the harbor, she saw Soraya's hand tighten faintly on the arm of the chair. Mara did not press deeper. She only went on in a soft voice, saying she was glad Soraya was still here, still sitting here to watch the snowfall, because this world would be missing something if she were gone. And then, for the first time since Mara had entered the room, Soraya slowly turned her head. Those tired, guarded eyes looked straight at Mara, searching, suspicious, yet also holding the faintest glimmer of something fragile, like a person sinking beneath water seeing light above the surface for the first time. The girl looked at Mara for a long while, then in a hoarse, dry voice that sounded as if it had not been used in a long time, she whispered a single sentence, asking whether Mara was the person in the water that day. Mara felt her chest tighten with emotion. She nodded gently and answered that yes, it was her, that she had been there, and that she would always be glad she had been there. Soraya's eyes filled with tears, her lips trembling as if she wanted to say something more, and then stopped herself. She turned back toward the window, but this time she did not pull the curtain of hair over her face again, and Mara understood that it was a silent permission, a door opened by only the narrowest crack. Mara said nothing more. She simply sat there with Soraya as the late afternoon light slowly faded over the white garden. Two strange women connected by one freezing night and by the fragile thread of trust just beginning to form. Outside the door, Kane stood silent in the darkness of the hallway. Through the narrow crack, he had heard his sister's voice, the voice he had longed to hear for so many weeks, and something inside the chest of that steel man quietly cracked, because he realized that the ordinary baker had done in one afternoon what all his power and money had failed to do for weeks. She had made Soraya willing to speak, willing to turn toward another human being, willing to let one ray of light enter the dark room of her soul. That night, after the mansion had sunk into a deep stillness, and the servants had withdrawn to their rooms, Mara could not sleep in the unfamiliar bedroom beside Soraya's, and when she stepped into the hallway to look for a cup of warm water, she heard a faint sound coming from the girl's room, the restless shifting of a body and the broken, hurried breaths of someone struggling against wordless nightmares. Mara knocked softly, then pushed the door open and saw Soraya sitting upright in bed, both arms wrapped tightly around her knees, her eyes wide and vacant as she stared into the darkness, as if she were sinking once more into the freezing water of that night. Instead of asking questions or offering hollow comfort, Mara only held out her hand and said she knew a place warmer than this room, a place she always went whenever her mind was tangled and unable to rest, and she invited Soraya to come with her. The girl hesitated for a moment, but perhaps because there was no pressure at all in Mara's gentle voice, she slowly placed her thin hand into that warm, calloused palm and allowed herself to be led away. Mara took Soraya down to the great kitchen of the mansion, a space of cold steel and stone that she had quietly explored earlier that afternoon, and she turned on the oven, took out flour, yeast, salt, and water, then laid everything on the large wooden table in the middle of the kitchen. Soraya stood close by, confused as she watched the other woman work, and Mara smiled and said she would teach her how to make bread, that this was what her hands had done thousands of times over the past 6 years, and that there was a strange kind of magic in kneading dough that she had never found anywhere else. She poured the flour onto the table, dusted the surface lightly, then took Soraya's hands and placed them on the soft, warm dough, guiding the girl to press down with the heels of her palms, fold the dough over, turn it, then press down again, a steady and enduring rhythm. At first, Soraya's fingers were clumsy and hesitant, but little by little, with the repeated motion of kneading, Mara saw the tightness in the girl's shoulders begin to loosen, her rushed breathing become more even, and that vacant gaze slowly focus on the dough changing beneath her hands. Mara said softly that when the girl kneaded dough, she could not think about anything else, could not sink into the dark thoughts that kept twisting through her mind, because her hands were busy and her mind had to follow every movement, and that was exactly how this work had saved Mara herself, through so many of the darkest long nights of her life. Soraya did not answer, but she kneaded more and more intently, as if pouring all the storms inside her into that lump of dough, and when warmth from the oven began to spread through the kitchen, along with the gentle scent of rising yeast, Mara noticed a small miracle taking place. Color slowly returned to the girl's pale cheeks, and for the first time, the corner of her mouth curved into a tired but genuine smile. Mara taught her how to let the dough rise, how to wait patiently for quiet life to grow beneath a damp cloth. And she said that baking taught people a lesson about patience and hope, that sometimes we had to wait in the dark before something beautiful and warm could take shape. Soraya lifted her eyes to Mara, and in a soft, uncertain voice, she confessed that this was the first time in a very long while that her mind had felt peaceful, without the chaotic noise screaming inside it. Mara gently squeezed the girl's shoulder and said that peace was always there waiting for her, that whenever the waves inside her began to rise, she only needed to find something that kept her hands busy, some small and honest task, and the world would slowly become gentler. What neither of the two women knew was that at the kitchen threshold, hidden in the darkness, Kane Voss stood silently watching. He had woken and followed the smell of baking bread and the warm light spilling from the kitchen that was usually so cold, and now he stood there, watching his sister, the girl he had feared was lost forever to silence, smiling beside a lump of dough, her hands dusted white with flour, and her face touched by life for the first time in many weeks. He did not step inside. He did not speak, because he understood that his presence might break this precious, fragile moment. He only stood there quietly, his cold hands clenched at his sides, and in those steel-gray eyes that were usually so hard, something warm and aching appeared for the first time, a silent gratitude toward the baker, who had brought warmth back into his frozen house and lit a small ray of light inside his sister's soul. The next morning, when the weak rays of winter sunlight slipped through the large windows of the dining room, Mara decided to do something this mansion had never seen before. She set 3 plates on the long dining table, where usually only one person sat, and in the middle of the table she placed the basket of hot bread she and Soraya had baked together during the night. Its golden crust still giving off warmth and its rich fragrance spreading through the room that had always felt so cold. When Cain walked in with his usual stern expression, he stopped short at the sight of his sister sitting at the dining table, something that had not happened for many weeks since the incident, and Mara only smiled and pulled out a chair, inviting him to sit across from Soraya instead of at the distant head of the table as he always did. Breakfast began in an awkward silence. Cain ate mechanically and cautiously, sometimes glancing at his sister, as if afraid that one wrong word could make her retreat back into herself, while Soraya lowered her head and tore her bread into small pieces. But Mara noticed that the girl was eating, truly eating, the very thing the servants had complained they could never manage to make her do. Mara gently broke the silence with simple little stories about baking, about the time she burned an entire batch of cookies because she fell asleep beside the oven at dawn, and the soft laugh that slipped from Soraya made the whole room seem warmer, made Cain's eyes widen slightly with surprise. Then, encouraged by the rare warmth in the air and by Mara's steady presence beside her, Soraya set down the piece of bread, and in a voice that was quiet but firmer than anything she had said before, she lifted her eyes to her brother and told him she needed him to listen to her, truly listen. Cain set down his knife and fork, his whole body tightening with caution, and Soraya continued, her eyes bright with tears but her voice not trembling at all. She said that for all these years, he had locked her inside these walls in the name of protecting her, had surrounded her with guards, cameras, and locked doors, until she no longer felt like a person, but only a precious possession that had to be stored inside a safe. She said she understood that he had done all of it because he was afraid of losing her, because after their parents died, he had turned himself into a shield for her. But that suffocating love had slowly strangled her, had made her feel lonelier than ever, in the middle of a castle full of people, had driven her to that night when she wandered alone to the harbor, just so she could breathe air that was not watched, not controlled, just so she could feel that she still existed. Every word from Soraya cut into Cain like a cold knife. The steelman's face went pale, and his hands, always so cold and steady, gripped the edge of the table until his knuckles turned white, because he had never imagined that the walls he had built to protect her were the very things imprisoning his sister, that his fear of losing her had unknowingly pushed her farther away. He opened his mouth as if to say something, perhaps an excuse, perhaps a denial, but then he closed it again, because beneath his sister's honest and wounded gaze, every word became hollow. Mara sat quietly beside them. She did not step into the conversation between brother and sister, only placed one warm hand over Soraya's as an anchor, a silent acknowledgement that the girl had the right to speak her truth, had the right to be heard. She softly told Cain that sometimes what makes a person safe is not high walls or strong locks, but the feeling of being trusted, of being respected as a human being with longings and pain of her own. That Soraya did not need a golden cage. She needed a home where she was allowed to breathe. Cain looked at Mara, then at his sister, and in that moment something in his unshakable hardness seemed to crack. He slowly nodded and said in a low, hoarse voice, rare in its emotion, that he was sorry, that he had never wanted her to feel imprisoned, that he had simply been too terrified of losing the only family he had left. It was the first time Soraya had ever heard her brother speak the words "I'm sorry," and tears spilled from the girl's eyes, not because of pain, but because something inside her had just been loosened, a knot that had been pulled tight for years, finally beginning to come undone. Mara looked at the two of them, her heart filling with quiet emotion, because she understood that true healing did not lie only in pulling someone out of freezing water, but also in helping them break the invisible walls that had held their hearts captive for so long. And for the first time since she had stepped into this cold mansion, she felt that this place had begun to hold a little of the warmth of a real home. In the days that followed, a new habit slowly formed inside the mansion that had once been so cold. Every morning, Mara and Soraya went down to the kitchen to bake bread. Every afternoon, the two of them sat by the window talking or quietly watching the snow, and little by little, Mara noticed the girl returning to life, her eyes brighter, her voice steadier, smiles appearing more often. But precisely because she was closer to Soraya than anyone else, Mara also began to notice things other people overlooked, and one of them was the strange change in the girl's condition every evening. She realized that although Soraya was far more alert and lively during the day, every night, after taking the dose of medicine the servant brought upstairs, the girl would fall into a dull state of exhaustion, her eyes turning vacant and lifeless, her mind moving slowly as if sinking into fog, and sometimes she would murmur disconnected things or tremble for no clear reason. At first, Mara thought it was only an ordinary side effect of a sedative, but the instinct of someone who had spent years caring for sick family members told her that something was wrong, because Soraya's reaction to the medicine seemed far too severe for a normal treatment meant to help someone stabilize and recover. One evening, while helping Soraya get ready for bed, Mara noticed the blister pack of pills on the nightstand, and she picked it up to examine it, worry and curiosity rising together inside her. She was not a doctor, but the years she had spent sitting at the bedside of someone she loved had taught her how to read medicine labels, how to recognize the names of certain drugs and dosages. And when she looked closely at the blister pack and the instructions that came with it, a cold feeling climbed up her spine. The dosage printed on the pack was far higher than what she knew was usual for someone in Soraya's condition, and beside it was another pill she did not recognize, one that did not match anything written on the prescription sheet she had once glimpsed tucked inside the girl's file. Mara carefully memorized the names of the medications, and that night, after Soraya had fallen into a heavy sleep, she quietly searched on her old phone, and what she read only made her suspicion grow. The combination of these medications, along with the unusually high dosage, according to what she found, did not seem to help a person recover, but could instead make them increasingly dependent, foggy, disoriented, and emotionally weakened, as if someone did not want Soraya to get better, but wanted to keep her forever fragile and reliant on others. Mara remembered that all of Soraya's medications were prescribed and supervised by the family's private psychiatrist, a woman named Adelaide Quinn. The calm, polished doctor who came to the mansion every week, the person the entire Voss household trusted completely and had fully entrusted with the girl's mental care. A cold suspicion began taking shape in Mara's mind, because if this medication was truly a problem, then it could not be an innocent mistake. An experienced psychiatrist could not possibly get something so basic wrong, and the only person with complete control over what Soraya put into her body every night was Dr. Quinn. But Mara was also clear-headed enough to know that she had no real evidence in her hands, only a blister pack of pills, an instinct, and a few hurried lines of information found online. And accusing a doctor who was absolutely trusted by this powerful family would be extremely dangerous. If she spoke without proof, people could say she was only a meddling baker overstepping her place, and she could be thrown out of this house, leaving Soraya alone to face the danger Mara had just begun to glimpse. All that night, Mara tossed and turned without sleeping, the image of Soraya's vacant eyes after each dose haunting her mind, and she wondered whether she was imagining too much, whether her own wariness was turning ordinary things into conspiracy. But then she remembered the stark contrast between Soraya, alive and bright during the day beside the bread dough, and Soraya, dazed and drained every night, and she knew her instinct was not without reason. She decided that she would not rush to accuse anyone, but she would watch quietly, secretly keep one blister pack as evidence, and wait until she had enough in her hands to protect the girl she had once saved from the freezing water, because she had once been helpless as she watched someone she loved slip away. And this time she promised herself that she would not let it happen again, no matter what price she had to pay. One weekend afternoon, just after Dr. Adelaide Quinn had finished her routine visit with Soraya and was gathering her things in the hallway, Mara happened to pass by and heard the doctor speaking on the phone in a low, tense voice, completely different from her usual calm and polished manner. Mara did not mean to eavesdrop, but a few broken sentences still reached her ears. Dr. Quinn mentioned her daughter, mentioned some extremely expensive medical treatment overseas that she could not possibly afford. Her voice catching as she said she had no other choice, that she had exhausted every resource and time waited for no one. When she realized someone was nearby, Dr. Quinn hurriedly ended the call and turned around with the professional composure already fixed back onto her face, smiling and greeting at Mara before walking away. But Mara still caught sight of the reddened eyes and the tense lines carved across the woman's forehead. That moment left in Mara's mind a feeling she could not quite name, a passing sympathy mixed with the suspicions still smoldering inside her about the pills, though at the time she could not yet connect the two, only knowing that behind the doctor's flawless exterior was a human being carrying some enormous despair. That evening, after Soraya had fallen asleep, Mara went down to the study to return a few books she had borrowed, and she found Kane sitting alone beside the fireplace, the flames casting warm streaks of light over his usually cold face, a glass of whiskey untouched on the arm of his chair. He looked up at her, and instead of the cold scrutiny of the first days, his eyes now carried a tired gentleness as he quietly invited her to sit in the chair beside him. They sat in silence for a while in the warmth of the fire. Then Kane slowly spoke, saying he had never properly thanked her, not because of the money or the contract, but because of what she had brought into this house, because of Soraya's laughter, which he had thought he would never hear again. Mara softly answered that she had only done what anyone should have done, but Kane shook his head. He said no. Most people would have turned away, would have chosen their own safety, and she alone had plunged into freezing water for a stranger, then stepped into his dangerous world without backing down. In a deep, hoarse voice, rare in its openness, he told her about his childhood, about the night his parents died and left him with a little sister he had sworn to protect at any cost, about how he had built an entire empire of power around the single belief that if he became strong enough, rich enough, frightening enough, then no one would ever be able to take away the person he loved again. Mara listened, and she realized that behind the icy shell of the most powerful boss in New England was a boy who had once lost everything and become so afraid that he had turned that fear into steel walls. She gently placed her hand over his, and for the first time, she felt warmth beginning to seep into those hands that had always seemed cold. Kane looked down at the small calloused hand, roughened by bread dough, resting over his, then lifted his eyes to hers, and in that moment the distance between them seemed to dissolve. The firelight reflected in both their eyes, and the air between them grew heavy, with a feeling neither had yet dared to name, but one that had been quietly taking root through all the days behind them. Mara felt her heart beating fast. She found herself leaning slightly closer, and Kane did the same, his steel-gray eyes softening as he looked at her as though she were the only warmth in his frozen life. But at that fragile moment, the study door opened, and one of Kane's security men stepped in with a tense face. He quickly apologized for interrupting, then reported that something urgent had happened at the harbor, a serious matter involving the family's rivals. Kane immediately stood, the cold mask of the boss returning in an instant. He gave Mara's hand one brief squeeze, like a promise for something left unfinished, then strode out of the room, leaving her alone beside the fireplace, with her heart still unsteady, and a vague instinct that the short, peaceful days they had just lived through were about to be swept away by some coming storm, that the dangerous world beyond these walls was beginning to tighten around all of them. That night, while Kane was still busy handling the urgent matter at the harbor, and the mansion had sunk into silence, Mara startled awake because of an uneasy instinct. She stepped into Soraya's room and found the bed empty, the door left ajar, the young woman gone from her room in the middle of the night. Mara's heart pounded, but instead of immediately alerting the entire security team and breaking the promise of respect she had given Soraya, she decided to search on her own, because she believed that if the girl had wanted to hide somewhere, what she needed was a friend coming to find her, not a squad of guards surrounding her like a criminal. Mara remembered the time Soraya had whispered about a place that had once belonged only to her, a small art studio in the old neighborhood, where she had studied art before being brought back to live behind walls. and instinct told Mara that the girl had returned to that very place. She called a taxi and followed the address Soraya had once mentioned, crossing the empty frozen streets of Boston at night, and when she arrived she found an old brick building, with a warm yellow light still glowing faintly in an upstairs window. Mara climbed the creaking wooden stairs, pushed open the half-closed door, and the sight inside made her go still. It was an art studio filled with paintings, canvases standing in every corner, and Soraya was sitting in the middle of the room on a floor stained with paint, her hands smeared with color, her hair tangled, her eyes wet with tears, yet no longer holding the hollow, vacant look of the first days. Instead, they shone with something fiercely and vividly alive. Mara stepped in gently, and when her eyes moved across the paintings, she understood that she was looking straight into the girl's inner world. Dark paintings in cold gray tones, lonely shapes sinking into shadows, hands reaching out from black water, trying to grasp a distant light. All of it like the silent cry for help of a soul that had been imprisoned and forgotten for too long. But among those dark paintings, Mara noticed an unfinished canvas resting on an easel. And in this new painting, there was something entirely different. There was a warm streak of light entering the darkness. There was another hand gripping the hand that was sinking, and Mara recognized that image as the moment she had pulled Soraya up from the freezing water. Soraya lifted her eyes to Mara, and in a choked voice, she confessed that art had once been her whole world, the only place where she could be herself, where she could pour out everything she could not say aloud. But people had taken even that from her, had locked her away and treated her passion as meaningless. And the night she wandered to the harbor was also the night she felt she had lost everything that made her still want to exist. Mara knelt beside the girl, not rushing to deny anything or offer advice. She only listened, then gently said that these paintings were not meaningless at all, that they were beautiful and heartbreakingly honest, that it was often from the darkest places inside a person, that they created things capable of making others understand they were not alone. She pointed to the unfinished painting with a warm streak of light, and said this was what she wanted Soraya to remember, that no matter how deep the darkness became, there was always a hand ready to reach down, always light finding a way in, and that the girl deserved to keep painting those pictures with light. Just then, hurried footsteps sounded on the stairs, and Kane rushed into the studio, his face pale with panic and anger. He had discovered that both of them were gone, and had searched the city frantically. He turned to Mara, his voice full of fury as he accused her of recklessly taking his sister outside in the middle of the night without telling anyone, of placing the girl in danger. But Mara stood straight before him, completely unshaken, and answered that she had not taken Soraya anywhere, that she had come here because she trusted the girl and wanted to let her be a human being, not a prisoner. She told him plainly that if he truly wanted his sister to recover, he had to learn to loosen his grip on his own fear, had to see Soraya as she truly was, an artist with a soul that needed the freedom to breathe and create, not a fragile treasure that needed to be locked away. The anger on Kane's face gradually faded, as his eyes moved across the paintings, across the colors heavy with his sister's pain he had never known existed, and finally stopped on the painting with the warm light and the two hands holding on to each other. He stood silent for a long time, then turned to Mara with a completely different look, no longer angry, but filled with an aching understanding. He said softly that he had never known his sister carried these things inside her, that perhaps all these years he had protected her body while forgetting her soul. He stepped forward, knelt beside Soraya, and for the first time in a very long while, that steel man held his sister tightly, whispering that from now on he would let her paint, let her live, let her be herself. And in that small art studio filled with paintings, beneath the warm yellow light, 3 wounded people in 3 different ways found among one another. For the first time, a thread of understanding and hope. The charity auction raising funds for mental health care programs was held in a magnificent grand hall in the center of Boston, and it was an event Kane could not miss, because rumors had begun spreading through high society that the sister of Boss Voss had broken down, lost her mind, and was no longer capable of appearing in public, and those very rumors were being used by his enemies to destabilize his entire empire. Kane knew the only way to silence them was to let Soraya appear, calm and steady, proving that she was all right, and although his heart was filled with worry, he still asked his sister what she wanted. this time not as an order but as a true request, and Soraya, with the courage she had newly found again, agreed, as long as Mara stayed beside her. That evening, when Mara stood before the mirror in the deep blue evening gown that had been prepared for her, she felt so out of place and insecure that she wanted to run away, because she was not the slender, elegant kind of woman who usually entered places like this. She was a plump girl with rounded shoulders and a freckled face, and she feared that amid that sea of glittering people, she would become a joke, an outsider judged by every eye in the room. Just then, Kane stepped up behind her. He looked at her through the mirror, and in a rare, warm voice, he said she was beautiful. Not the false beauty people wore through money, but a warm and honest beauty that came from within, the kind of beauty that the entire room put together could not possess. He said a person's worth did not lie in the shape of their body or the expensive clothes they wore, but in what they had done, and that she, the woman who had not hesitated to plunge into freezing water for the life of a stranger, carried a worth no diamond in that hall could match. Those words poured a strange warmth into Mara's heart. She lifted her head, and for the first time in her life, she entered a place so luxurious without lowering her face to hide. The auction moved through glittering crystal light and polite conversation. Soraya held Mara's hand tightly, and the steady presence of the baker beside her helped the young woman remain calm before hundreds of curious and searching eyes. But as the night deepened, the crowd slowly parted, and an older man with neatly combed silver hair and a courteous but cold smile approached. It was Donato Ferro, the man Mara had heard mentioned as the greatest rival of the Voss family, the one who had long hungered to swallow the port system Kane controlled. Ferro greeted Kane with false familiarity, his eyes passing over Soraya with an attentiveness that made Mara's skin prickle. Then he leaned down and spoke to the young woman in a sweet voice heavy with hidden meaning, saying that it was such a relief to see she could still pull herself together after everything, that everyone had been so worried about her fragile health, that it was such a pity for a young woman to carry such a heavy mental burden. Every word Ferro spoke carried a layer of threat beneath the surface of concern, as if he were planting in the minds of everyone around them the idea that Soraya was unstable and weak, and Mara could clearly feel the girl begin to tremble, her shoulders shrinking beneath the old man's gaze. She immediately stepped forward, placing herself between Ferro and Soraya, and in a calm but firm voice, she answered that Soraya was recovering very well and did not need anyone to worry on her behalf, that sometimes what a person needed was not pity but to be left in peace. Ferro raised an eyebrow and looked at Mara with amusement mixed with contempt. He asked who she was to dare speak, and Kane stepped forward, placing one hand on Mara's shoulder in a gesture heavy with protective meaning. In a voice cold as ice, he answered that she was one of his family, and that Ferro should be careful with every word he chose to say. The air between the two powerful men tightened like a stretched string for one moment, the social smiles still resting on their lips while their eyes held naked confrontation. Then Ferro let out a soft laugh and lifted a hand as if yielding. He said he had only come to express concern, then turned and left with his entourage, but before disappearing completely, he looked back and cast Mara a sharp, calculating stare, a look that made her understand she had just entered the sights of a dangerous man. Once Ferro had gone, Kane gently tightened his hand on Mara's shoulder, and said quietly that they needed to leave soon, that Ferro's appearance tonight was not a coincidence but a silent declaration of war, and that his enemy had scented the weakness they could exploit, Soraya herself. Mara held the trembling young woman close, a cold unease rising in her chest, because she was beginning to feel that the troubling medication, Ferro's calculating gaze, and the desperation of Dr. Quinn she had once accidentally witnessed might be pieces of some dark picture slowly coming into view, a conspiracy aimed straight at the girl Mara had sworn to protect at any cost. After the auction, the suspicion inside Mara burned more fiercely than ever, and she decided she could not wait any longer. She began quietly paying closer attention every time Dr. Quinn came to the mansion, discreetly watching every movement the woman made whenever she brought Soraya's medication. One evening, when Soraya suddenly fell into a violent panic after a day that had otherwise been very peaceful, the girl trembled and clutched her head, her breathing rushed and broken, her eyes wide and vacant as if she were sinking back into dark memories, and Mara, who was always beside her, immediately held her, gently reminding her to breathe slowly, reminding her that she was safe, that she was here, in the warm room, not beneath the freezing water. Just as Mara was soothing the girl, Dr. Quinn hurried in with a small syringe and an unfamiliar pill in her hand, saying in an urgent voice that Soraya needed medication right away to calm her. But something in that haste, in the doctor's evasive eyes, made Mara suddenly become fiercely alert. She looked at the pill in Dr. Quinn's hand and recognized at once that it was not Soraya's usual medication. It was a different color, a different shape. An instinct told Mara that this was the very thing she had suspected for so long. The thing that had left the girl dazed and drained every night. Mara immediately stepped between Dr. Quinn and Soraya, gripped the woman's arm tightly, and asked her directly what the medicine was, why it was different from the pills before. And when Dr. Quinn stammered and tried to circle around the truth by saying it was only an emergency dose, Mara had already snatched the pill from her hand and clenched it in her palm like undeniable evidence. Dr. Quinn's face turned pale, her eyes flashing with the panic of someone caught in the act, and that reaction confirmed every suspicion in Mara's heart. She looked straight into the woman's eyes and said in a voice shaking with anger that she knew, that she had kept the blister pack, that she knew what people were putting into Soraya's body was not helping the girl get better, but slowly dragging her under. In that cornered moment, Dr. Quinn's cold professionalism collapsed. She stepped back, her hands trembling, and broken confessions began to spill out. She said she had had no choice, that people had forced her, that all she had been required to do was keep Soraya weak and foggy long enough. Mara tightened her grip and asked who was behind it, and the name that came from Dr. Quinn's mouth made the blood in her body seem to freeze. It was Donato Ferro. The dark pieces finally locked together into a clear and chilling picture inside Mara's mind. Dr. Quinn choked out an explanation, saying that according to the terms of the Voss family trust, if Soraya were declared by a medical board to be legally incapacitated, no longer clear-minded enough to make decisions for herself, then control of her vast assets, including her shares in the port system, would be transferred to a management board, where Ferro had quietly planted his own people. That vicious scheme was not meant to kill Soraya, but to turn her into a weak, foggy, broken puppet, then use that very condition as proof to strip away all her rights and strangle Kane's empire, from within without firing a single shot. Mara understood that the night she had saved Soraya at the harbor had likely been part of this cruel plan as well, that the enemy had wanted to exploit the girl's crisis to push everything further, and that now, with Soraya slowly recovering because of Mara, they were being forced to act quickly before the girl became clear enough to expose everything. There was no more time to hesitate. Mara knew the mansion was no longer safe, that Dr. Quinn might not be the only person Ferro had bought within the circle surrounding them, and the instinct to protect rose powerfully inside her. She looked at Dr. Quinn. The woman collapsed into a chair with a tear-soaked face and the torn anguish of someone driven to the edge, and although Mara's heart was tangled with emotion, she knew this was not the time. She turned and held Soraya, who was still panicking, then said gently but firmly that they had to leave at once, that she needed Soraya to trust her one more time. She helped the girl out of the room, her heart pounding with worry, urgently searching for a way to warn Kane and take Soraya somewhere safe. But the moment they stepped into the dark hallway, Mara suddenly realized that their footsteps were echoing through an unnatural stillness, that the mansion tonight was terrifyingly quiet, and a cold instinct told her they might already be one step too late, that the storm she had feared for so long had finally arrived at their door. Mara helped Soraya along the dark hallway, but she had only just managed to guide the girl into a hidden corner behind the doorway, when she heard Dr. Quinn's choked voice coming from the room at the end of the hall. The woman was collapsed beside a small table, the phone pressed close to her ear, and the words she spoke through her sobs made Mara freeze. Dr. Quinn begged the person on the other end of the line, saying she had done everything they asked, that she couldn't go any further, that she had never wanted to hurt that girl, and then her voice broke completely when she mentioned her own daughter, her only child lying in a hospital, waiting for an expensive treatment that only the money Ferro had promised could possibly save. Mara stood motionless in the darkness, her heart torn between fury and an unexpected sorrow, because through each broken word, she realized that Dr. Quinn was not a cold-blooded villain, but a desperate mother backed into a corner, a decent human being whose fear of losing her child had turned her into a tool in the hands of evil. Through her tears, Dr. Quinn confessed that she had been the one who revealed the family's entire schedule to Pharaoh, that she had quietly cleared the path for his plan, and that everything had now been arranged to take Soraya away that very night. Mara understood that she was one step too late, and at that exact moment, the sound of a car engine rose from the courtyard, along with hurried footsteps entering the mansion. A group of people in white medical uniforms walked in with a cold, professional air, led by a man holding a folder, who announced that they had come to transfer Soraya to a specialized treatment facility under medical orders. Mara immediately understood that this was Pharaoh's final move. Beneath the disguise of a lawful medical transfer, they would take Soraya to a place where the girl would be imprisoned forever in a foggy state, declared incapacitated, and never again given the chance to speak for herself. She rushed out and stood in front of the group, spreading her arms to shield Soraya behind her, and declared clearly that the girl was not going anywhere, that, without Kane's consent, no one was allowed to take Soraya out of this house. The man holding the folder only smiled coldly, and replied that all the paperwork was complete and valid, that she was merely a hired employee with no right to interfere in a medical decision, then signaled for the people behind him to move forward. Soraya began trembling violently, her eyes filled with terror as she realized she was about to be dragged back into the darkness she had only just struggled to escape. She clung to Mara as if clinging to the only life raft she had left, and Mara squeezed the girl's hand tightly, whispering that she would not let anyone take Soraya away, that she had promised and she would keep her word. In the middle of that chaos, Dr. Quinn stepped out of the room, her face soaked with tears, and in the moment when she stood between two choices, between desperation for her own daughter and a conscience screaming against the crime she was helping commit, she looked at Mara with eyes begging for forgiveness, but still without enough courage to stop it. The group moved in closer, and although Mara fought fiercely, although she shouted for help, she could not stop an entire group that had been carefully arranged. They tore Soraya from her arms and carried the sobbing girl into a waiting car outside. Mara was shoved down onto the cold hallway floor, and through her furious tears she watched the car roll away and disappear into the night, taking with it the girl she had sworn to protect. Her heart shattered by the familiar and terrifying feeling of helplessness, the feeling that had once tormented her years ago when she stood watching someone she loved slip away and could do nothing. But this time, instead of collapsing, a fire of determination blazed inside her. Mara pushed herself up and ran to find Kane, and when she found him just returning from the harbor, she told him everything in breathless fragments, about Pharaoh's conspiracy, about the trust clause, about Dr. Quinn, and about Soraya having just been taken away under the name of a medical transfer. Kane's face darkened, his steel-gray eyes flashing with a deadly coldness unlike anything she had ever seen. But when Mara mentioned Dr. Quinn and the woman's gravely ill daughter, something complicated passed through his gaze, because both he and Mara understood that the true enemy was not that desperate woman, but Pharaoh, the man who had exploited the most sacred love of a mother to turn a decent person into a pawn in his cruel game. Kane gripped Mara's hand tightly, and in a deep voice filled with ringing resolve, he said they had to leave immediately, that he knew exactly where Pharaoh would take his sister, and that this time he would not let his enemy steal the last person he loved again. Kane rushed out of the mansion with Mara close behind him. He drove the armored car himself, speeding into the freezing Boston night, his always cold hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly that his knuckles turned white, and in the flashes of streetlight sweeping across his face, Mara saw a mixture of a brother's fear and the deadly coldness of a boss about to face the greatest enemy of his life. He explained in a hurried breath that Pharaoh would not take Soraya to a real hospital, but to the very old abandoned port his family had once controlled. A quiet place hidden from sight, because his enemy wanted to stage a perfect performance, the unfortunate accident of a mentally unstable young woman, to close everything cleanly and leave no trace behind. Mara felt her chest tighten when she understood the cruelty of that scheme. They intended to take Soraya back to the very place where she had nearly lost her life, to turn her pain into a reasonable story that would hide their crime, and it hurt Mara even more because it reflected the fateful night when she had first pulled Soraya from the black water. The car turned onto the road leading to the harbor, where old warehouses stood motionless like ghosts in the fog, the dark water of the bay stretching coldly beneath the dim moonlight. And Kane turned off the headlights, letting the car creep slowly through the darkness so they would not alert the enemy. They got out and moved along the damp concrete walls, and through the thin mist, Mara saw headlights in the distance from several cars parked close to the edge of the pier, by shadows moving around them, and in the middle of those figures was a small familiar shape being led toward the water. It was Soraya. Mara's heart seemed to stop. Her instinct pushed her to run straight toward the girl, but Kane held her back, whispering that they could not act recklessly, that Pharaoh had his people everywhere, and one wrong move could cost all three of them dearly. He signaled to his loyal security team, the men who had silently followed in another car, and they quietly spread out to surround the area. While waiting for the right moment, Mara held her breath and watched, her heart twisting as she saw that Soraya was still dazed from the medication, her legs unsteady, her vacant eyes looking around as if she did not understand what was happening. Standing among the group was Donato Ferro, relaxed as if enjoying a performance he had directed himself, his polite and cold voice carrying through the wind as he told his men to be gentle, that everything had to look natural, like a tragedy no one could question. Mara heard every word, and it felt as if fire were burning through her insides. She looked at Kane and saw his face harden, but she also saw the calculation in his eyes. He was waiting for the instant his enemy made a mistake, so he could strike without putting Soraya in danger. But then every plan suddenly collapsed when one of Pharaoh's men accidentally spotted the security team moving in the fog. He shouted, and in an instant the tense stillness shattered into chaos. Shadows rushing at one another, angry voices ringing through the night at the harbor. Taking advantage of the confusion, Mara could think of nothing but Soraya. She broke from hiding and ran across the chaos toward the girl who was swaying helplessly, and she saw Pharaoh, realizing that his game was falling apart, seize Soraya and drag her slowly back toward the slick edge of the pier, using her as his final shield and bargaining piece. Mara screamed Soraya's name, her voice tearing through the cold fog, and when the girl heard that familiar call, she lifted her head, her drug-dulled eyes flickering with a trace of recognition, a trace of hope in the middle of her haze. Kane rushed forward too, shouting at Pharaoh to let his sister go, his voice full of authority and the urgency of a brother, watching the only family he had left stand on the edge of disaster. But Pharaoh only gave a bitter laugh. He knew he had reached the end, and he seemed ready to drag everyone down with him. Mara stopped a few steps away from them, breathless, her heart pounding wildly, and in that hanging moment she realized Dr. Quinn had also arrived in a panic, the woman's face white with horror, as she witnessed the true consequence of what she had helped set in motion. Mara understood that this time she did not need only strength to save Soraya. She needed something stronger than force. She needed to reach the last piece of conscience left in the person, standing on the line between good and evil, before everything sank into the freezing water waiting below. Mara stood on that fragile line, her breathing rushed in the skin, cutting cold of the harbor, and instead of charging forward in desperation, she forced herself to stay calm, because she understood that the only person who could change the situation now was not Pharaoh or his henchmen, but Dr. Quinn, who was standing and trembling at the edge of the chaotic crowd. Mara turned to the woman, and in a voice choked with emotion yet full of weight, she called her by name. She said she knew Dr. Quinn had been forced, knew she had done everything for her daughter, knew the heart of a mother could push people into doing things they themselves were horrified by. She said she understood the feeling of helplessness when someone you loved needed saving and you did not have the power to save them, because she had lived through that too, had lost family simply because she had not had enough to hold on to them, and that was why she did not blame her, but begged her to think about what her daughter would become if she grew up, and learned that her life had been traded for the life of another innocent girl. Mara said there was still time for her to choose again, that a true mother would never want to save her own child by destroying someone else's child, and that if she stopped now, she could still be the mother her daughter deserved to have. Each of Mara's words seemed like drops of water soaking into the ice of despair surrounding Dr. Quinn's heart, and Mara saw the woman's face streamed with tears, her shoulders shaking violently, and then in the decisive moment, Dr. Quinn turned and shouted at Pharaoh's men to stop, that she would confess everything, that she could not help this crime for even 1 second longer. The sudden betrayal from his own pawn left Pharaoh stunned and distracted for a moment, and at that exact instant, because of the struggle and the slick, icy pier beneath them, Soraya staggered out of his grip and plunged toward the dark water below. The sound of the water breaking open was heavy and cold, exactly the sound that had haunted Mara for so many weeks, and without 1 second of hesitation, without a single thought for the danger to herself, Mara rushed to the edge of the pier and threw herself into the freezing water once again, just as she had on that first fateful night. The cold struck like thousands of blades, slicing into her skin, squeezing the breath from her chest, but this time there was no fear in her heart, only a fierce determination. She drove her arms through the dark water, searching until she touched Soraya's limp arm as the girl sank lower, and she wrapped her arms tightly around her, gathering every last ounce of strength to kick upward toward the surface. The two of them broke through the water, Mara gasping for the bitter cold air, one arm holding Soraya firmly against her chest, her mouth whispering again and again that the girl should hold on to her, that she was here, that she would never let go. On the pier, Cain had used the moment of Pharaoh's confusion to charge forward and overpower him. He slammed his enemy down onto the harbor ground and pinned him there with all the strength of a brother who had almost lost his sister. But even in that moment of absolute rage, he did not cross the final line. He only held Pharaoh down until the sound of sirens tore through the night and the red and blue lights of police cars flooded the harbor. It turned out Cain had already had someone alert the authorities, and now law enforcement swept in, handcuffing Pharaoh and his men, while Dr. Quinn stood silently amid it all, tears in her eyes but her gaze lighter, like someone who had finally set down the burden of guilt and was ready to face the consequences. Cain rushed to the edge of the water. He dropped to his knees and reached out to pull Mara and Soraya onto the pier, and when all three of them sat soaked and shivering together on the freezing harbor ground, he wrapped both of them in his arms, his hands, once always cold, trembling now not from the cold but from emotion breaking open inside him. Soraya, though exhausted and nearly limp, still forced her eyes open to look at Mara, her pale lips moving faintly as she spoke the two words "thank you," and Mara held the girl tighter in her arms, tears mixing with harbor water as they streamed down her face, her heart filled with a happiness and peace she had never felt before, because this time she had not been helpless, this time she had reached out in time, and this time the person she had tried to save had stayed. 6 months passed, and summer had spread warm golden sunlight over the Boston streets that had once been covered in ice. On a peaceful corner in Dorchester, a lovely little bakery named The Light had opened its doors, a place where the smell of fresh bread and fragrant cinnamon drifted out every morning, making passers-by stop and step inside. It was Mara's bakery, a dream she had never dared to dream, quietly funded by Cain, but left entirely in her hands to build with the calloused fingers of a woman who loved her craft. Behind the glass counter stood Soraya in an apron dusted with flour, her cheeks fuller and rosy, a radiant smile on the face that had once been pale with despair. The young woman now helped Mara bake while following a proper and humane course of therapy, with a doctor who truly cared about her. On the bakery wall hung Soraya's paintings, no longer filled with cold gray shades sinking into darkness, but overflowing with light, warm streaks of sunshine, hands holding one another, and smiling faces, because the girl had found her art again, and this time no one could take it away from her anymore. As for Dr. Adelaide Quinn, she had honestly confessed the entire truth, and her testimony helped bring Pharaoh to justice. Because of her cooperation and the circumstances of a desperate mother, she received a light sentence, enough for her to atone for her mistakes, while still having the chance to return to her daughter, the child who had finally received treatment and was slowly getting better, thanks to the help Cain had quietly arranged, because he understood that the one truly to blame was Pharaoh, while Dr. Quinn was only a decent human being who had lost her way in the fear of losing her child. One afternoon, as golden sunlight slanted through the bakery window, Cain walked in, no longer wearing the cold black suit of a boss but only a simple shirt, looking much younger and lighter than before, his hands, once always cold, now knowing how to seek warmth. He came to Mara, and with Soraya smiling as witness, he took out a simple silver ring, not a showy glittering diamond, but a modest silver band engraved inside with a small line of words, and he said softly that he had spent his whole life building steel walls to keep the people he loved safe, but she, the woman who had dared to plunge into freezing water for the life of a stranger, had taught him that what truly keeps a person alive is not walls or power or money, but a hand willing to reach down when we are sinking. Mara, her eyes filled with tears, nodded and let him slide the ring onto her finger. And in that moment, 3 people who had each been wounded in their own way truly became a family, a warm home built not from cold stone, but from kindness, understanding, and love. Mara's story reminds us of something simple yet profound, that the value of a person does not lie in body shape, money, or status, but in the kindness and courage to reach out and help another person. That sometimes the people who seem most invisible and ordinary carry within them the power to warm an entire frozen world, that no one should be left alone in the dark, and that compassion, even for those who have lost their way, is also the light that can heal the deepest wounds. May each of us become the hand that reaches down for someone else, and may we also be brave enough to take that hand when we ourselves need to be saved. If this story has touched your heart, please subscribe to our channel. Hit like and share the video so you will not miss more meaningful and moving stories every day. How do you feel about Mara's story and Soraya's healing journey, and what touched you the most? Please leave a comment below to share the feelings from deep within your heart, because we always read and listen to every line you share. Thank you for taking the time to listen until the very final moments. I wish you, the person watching this video, good health always, a joyful life, peace and serenity every day. Goodbye, and see you again in the next videos.